Hello, my friends, writers, my loves. If you are wondering how on earth to structure your memoir in a way that makes it un-put-downable, and you want to write characters that make sense to your reader, then today's conversation is just for you. I'm joined by the glorious Chandika, who is just an unbelievably gifted collaborative writer and editor who has worked on over 150 books. Her clients have been published by Hay House, Sounds True, Shambhala Press, to name a few. This is going to be a conversation absolutely filled with gold. And I know that you are going to take away so many gems from this conversation. So I cannot wait to introduce you. Awesome. Welcome to the broadcast studio, Chandika. Like I said to you earlier, I've been really looking forward to this conversation. So thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really happy to be here.
So I feel like this is the big question, the whole structuring a memoir, because we can look at our life and be like, oh, there's so much there. There's so much that I want to talk about. So I'd love to hear your take for someone who, maybe has an idea of the sense of the story that they want to tell, but they're just trying to figure out how do I really structure this? I know you talk about sculpting, how do I sculpt this in a way that is going to make the story un-put-downable, that's really going to resonate to people?
Yeah, I think it starts with realizing that there is no way to fit your whole life into a book. Like, that is the difference between a memoir and an autobiography. And a memoir is meant to really center around a certain theme. Sometimes they're teaching. A lot of the memoirs I work with are meant to teach something, but sometimes they're really more about inspiring or just kind of discussing a theme, bringing something to light that your reader can relate to. But there's no way to fit your whole life into that. It's just not possible. And that can be a little bit shocking for people at first because, I mean, I'll speak of myself. I think my whole life is fascinating. I think absolutely everything that happened is worth telling. But if you've ever been at like a party with someone who is telling you too many details in the story for the story to really take off, that's what an unsculpted memoir looks like. And that's why I'm always encouraging people to really focus their memoir, to really narrow it down a bit.
Mm. This idea of focus is really important, and that analogy that you use of listening to someone telling a story, because it made me think about some of the feedback that you have given me on my chapters, where you've got this very well honed eye for sentences, paragraphs, pages where you're just like, wait, what's this doing here? Like, that's often some of the things that you said to me in my feedback, like, this paragraph was lovely, but like, what's the point, or what's it doing here? So I'm wondering, how do you get that feel for being able to say, this is making me question it, whereas this seems to fit and I'm not questioning why this is there?
How do I get that feel? I mean, feel is the operative word here because a lot of it is intuitive. Every scene, every character, every piece of your memoir that you're putting in needs to advance the story in some way for the reader, not just for yourself, the author. Again, this is the difference between an autobiography or like a journal entry, and the memoir. So the idea, I guess, would be that I look for anything that seems superfluous or just unnecessary, anything that feels like it's not advancing the story in some way. Mm-hmm. And sometimes it'll be something like a description of, I don't know, the neighbor's dog, outside the window or something. And I'll kind of keep my eye on it because I'm like, okay, now they're describing the neighbor's dog. Now they're describing the neighbor's flowers. Surely something's going to happen at the neighbor's house or with the neighbor. And so sometimes I kind of just flag it for myself and don't bring it up with an author in a coaching or editing process until I get more of the story. But if it never comes up again, that's one way to know that it was kind of an unnecessary detail. And I guess the other way to know is if it causes any distraction in me, if it causes me to kind of shake for a moment, if in that moment I realize, oh, I'm going to go grab a glass of water or something like that. Because, yeah, as you said, you really want a book that's un-put-downable, the kind that you're sitting there just thirsty and almost unaware of it, you know?
You need the toilet because you're like, I can't stop. I got to get, I've done that sometimes. I'm like, I need to pee, but I got to wait till I get to the end of the chapter.
Right. That's what we want. Chapters that make you hold your pee. I mean, it's difficult because we want to be more embodied, but reading is like that when you're really into it, so you can kind of you have an urge to put things off, even if you don't follow it.
Yeah. It's funny actually, because as I was listening to you, I was like, is this literally something that we do have to trust in an editor for? Because honestly, I remember early drafts of my memoir. There are so many scenes that are on the cutting room floor simply because I was like, oh, I just feel like I have to tell this scene, but it felt like I was telling it more for me. So as I'm listening to you and I'm thinking, I wasn't thinking about the reader at all. But I'm wondering if that is just something that only an editor can know, because like you say, our whole lives are fascinating to us. Is there a way that we can take ourselves out of our bodies and imagine being the reader?
We can try. It depends on how imaginative we are, really. I mean, it's kind of like acting, right? Like going into it, like, does every single piece of this matter? We can also, for folks who are on a budget, who are like working with an early draft, this is also what friends are for, partners, things like that. I mean, while I'll always encourage people to work with a professional editor, I do think that there's some pieces that a particularly savvy friend can help with. When I think of like telling a story at a party, right? A lot of times my partners, they're like elbowing me like, honey, they don't care about this part's not mattering, and I think that that's very real. I think we all have people in our lives who do that for us. So if you have someone great in your life to do that, that's one way to do it. And the other is to pretend to be someone like that. Pretend you're reading someone else's story, you're hearing them over talk at a party, and you're like, what parts would I kind of elbow them over,
Okay. So yeah, so a little bit of acting, a little bit of kind of remembering the friend who might, partner who might nudge you. And obviously, yeah, there is a budget involved. So we are going to let people know today how they can grab just a free consultation with you, just so that they can literally just chat through their project. So folks, we will let you know
Sure.
at the end how you can grab that. What would you say when you're working with people and you're helping them to sculpt their story and they kind of come with this whole like the douche of material and you're like, oh, how do we what are some of the common things that you find and some of the ways that you help people begin to really shape that?
Well, for one thing, most memoirs are essentially a positive change arc, occasionally a negative change arc, but mostly a positive change arc for the main character, who is the narrator, who is the author, right? And so in that way, the protagonist, the author, must be learning something. And if we can't say what that something is right off the bat, something's wrong. And so from that point, we can start to kind of narrow based on, does this serve the reader, or does this serve the protagonist rather, learning that thing or not?
I love that. That's a great question. Yeah. It's one of the things it's also making me think about is, when you started to call the writer as the protagonist, that was actually something I found really beneficial. Like in our sessions, you always used to refer to the protagonist as Gabriella. So I kind of got this sense of distance, and I found that really, really useful. And it's making me think of another phrase that you use, which is that we need to divorce our characters. So it's like I kind of divorced myself as the protagonist in the novel and got that space to step back and look. But I'd love to dive in a little deeper about how and why that's important to do also for our characters, and some of the traps that people fall into when they're trying to write characters in memoir.
Surely. I mean, I work with a lot of people who are interested in personal development. So they're highly introspective. These are folks who spend, or maybe are a little bit of overthinkers, and I'm one too. And so as a result, they want to get everything right. And they've really thought about it. They put their time in, you know, and they want to get every little piece in there. But the truth is, we don't know. In order to write a good character, we have to know the character's motivation for doing everything. And if these are the people in our actual lives, we don't actually know their motivation for doing everything. We don't actually know why they said what they said, why they did what they did. Sometimes we do, but not always. And so there is a degree of projection that is necessary to make a character separate from a person in your life that a lot of the authors I work with are uncomfortable with, because they're like, hey, in the rest of my life, I'm trying not to project. I'm trying not to assume. I know that I don't know. And that's fine. You don't need to know about your mom, for instance. But when mom becomes a character, you need to know about mom. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and you know what's really interesting is this wasn't something I understood until we started to really work on this concept of divorcing your characters. And I think it was something I really struggled with in earlier drafts. So I have an ex-boyfriend who runs throughout my memoir, and I didn't get him. I didn't understand why he was behaving in many ways. And that elusivity was so thick in the memoir. And, you know, your feedback was like, I don't get this person. So if we don't get them as the writer, our reader isn't going to get them. And that's pretty unsatisfying. And I don't think I'd really grasped that until you fed that back. And then you were like, literally go away and do character development on this person, even if they end up being slightly different. And I think it was great for you to give me that permission to do that. And I wonder if, yeah, do you get some kickback on that? Like people being like, oh, but you know, it's not, I'm not going to be telling the truth, or it's not going to be honest.
Well, it's different from being honest, because I think we are being honest. It's more just like embracing the fact that the perspective is going to be limited. You know, that's unavoidable. In some ways, it's like zooming out. Or I think of like when the space shuttle goes out from the planet Earth and suddenly you're able to see planet Earth and you don't get all the details, right? But you're like, oh yeah, there's a continent there, and I think it might be Africa. And you know, like, and you get kind of a sense from that perspective. I also think about, I don't know if you're familiar at all with like IFS, internal family systems, as a therapeutic model, but it's a method of therapy and of personal development and trauma work. And essentially it calls us to separate ourselves into different parts. They call it parts. And so in this case, like it's one part of you that is the protagonist in your novel, or your memoir. In your novel as well, you could have, actually in a novel, you could have many characters that are different parts of you. And in the same way, it's one part of this person that you are describing. So it's not that you're being dishonest. And I don't encourage people to lie. Sometimes you have to change details about a person to protect them or yourself, things like that. And that's necessary. But this is more just like limiting your perspective to that one part. And then once you grab that part, zooming out from it, again, like the space shuttle, and looking at it as, you know, what is this part if I were to look at it from there?
I found it hugely liberating, and I love the way that you describe it as it's like it's just one part of them, and also the way that you say as the protagonist in our memoir, it's like one part of us. Often it's one moment in our life.
Mm,
I'm
mm,
wondering now, this, if we come back to this idea of writing a character or writing a protagonist that the reader can understand, like you say, because you work on a lot of memoirs that are some kind of personal development journey. How often do you find it where someone comes to you with an idea? And I was certainly in this place when I first started to work on my memoir, that I actually didn't know the transformation that I had gone through. Like, I was still trying to figure it out. So even in early drafts, my own journey was really elusive. So what would you say when if someone's watching this and they're like, okay, I get the idea that I'm not going to tell my whole life story. This is really interesting, this conversation about character development. And you're saying, right at the start, we need to know what they're going to be learning or what they're learning. If someone's at that stage where they're like, oh, I'm still trying to figure it out myself, and I feel like I need to write the memoir in order to understand what my journey is, what would you say to someone who's in that position?
journal, journal, journal more, journal on the train, journal in the bathtub, journal on your bed, journal everywhere you can. And that is source material for your memoir, but it is not your memoir. That is the difference. I think a lot of people write a memoir too soon. And that doesn't mean too young in life. Sure, write a memoir when you're 15, that's great. But your memoir when you're 15 should end when you're 10. Your memoir when you're 30 should end when you're 20. Like, to give it some space so that you have done that. A lot of writers are very introspective thinking people, particularly folks who are interested in some degree of personal development. They're going to naturally be turning these things over in their head over and over again. And that's great, but it takes time. And particularly if it's a very traumatic event that you're looking back on, it takes time to be able to really boil it down to specific themes and specific moments that encapsulate those themes, and the particular characters that are most important to bring those themes to the surface. There are a few circumstances where that's not possible. For instance, in the last couple of years, I worked on a memoir by a woman who had ALS, and she actually just recently passed away. And she typed the entire memoir with her eyes. It's incredible. Can I plug it? Because it's great.
Please do.
It's called No Pressure, No Diamonds by Terry Dillian. Really highly recommend. And it's amazing. But in that case, we talked a lot. We typed a lot. We could only email about how she wished she had the time to process everything that happened with having ALS, but she didn't. And she needed to get this memoir out before she died, which she knew was coming soon. So in a case like that, it's it's not possible. But whenever it is possible, journal, 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 write, process. Use that as source material to draw from later, because your experiences in those moments of processing are so rich. And yet, I wouldn't call it a memoir. Maybe a very early draft of a memoir. And that can be really hard for some people to hear. But
yeah, like from the facial expression, it's funny. It is hard, and I wonder. I'm curious as to your take on this. Why it is so hard, and I'm in the same boat, in that the early stuff that I was writing, I wanted that to be in the final draft. I kind of wanted it to be all kind of raw and crazy. I'd love to hear your take on why we can be really attached to the writing, which is the processing or the processing, versus allowing ourselves to get to that place where we've got a little bit more distance and we can talk about it from a different perspective.
I mean, I would bounce it back to you. Like, what allowed that to be possible for you? I know this is kind of a cop-out, but I'm curious, you know?
Yeah. I think that when I'm in an experience, like when it's raw and all kind of flared up for me, what's triggered in me is a desire for comfort, is a desire for validation, and that's simply because I lacked it. And so I think for me, the experience was like, I need people to see me like this, and I need for them to love me like this. I need for this version of the story to be accepted and heard and seen. So it feels like at that stage, when I'm all raw and I'm basically triggered and massively in need of love, it seems like the ultimate act of rejection to say, but you can't write it like this. Like, no one's going to want to read this. I'm just like, oh, but you're literally you're totally triggering me in the very area that's very raw for me. So I can't say that's the same for everyone, but that's for me why I would be so attached. And it's only because I've had to go through many drafts of the memoir. I mean, I'm not saying I did these drafts without kicking and screaming. I would do a draft and I'd send it off to agents and I'd get feedback and I'd be like, right, I got to work on it again. So I was trying to submit these early drafts because I wanted to be seen in that way. And each of them were about a year apart because the submission process takes about 6 months. It takes that time to get the feedback. And so in that time, I was processing and I was getting a bit of distance. And then I was able to then look at the memoir and go, oh, oh my God, like that's just like a mad woman's rant. What was I thinking? So I don't know if that, if that makes sense to you, or if you're like, no, I feel like other people have that experience too, or again, how you would explain it.
Well, I think a lot of people have that experience. I mean, for sure. And a lot of memoir, a lot of times the topics are dear to us, usually something that was really difficult to go through or something that was really challenge, push us to our edge to learn, something like that. So for sure. But in that moment, I would always recommend that someone, again, splitting themselves into parts, let the rest of themselves see that one who wants to be seen, read their work, value their work. Just because I'm not saying it's not valuable by any means. It's of great value. It's of particular value to you, the writer, who is trying to process it all. And that does hold weight. I think that in this world, we put a lot of value on what other people think of us and not enough value on what we think of ourselves. And this is just a self-esteem issue, that each one of us has to confront, but surely it comes right up to the surface in the writing process.
Yeah. So let's pan out a bit, because you've seen a lot of books go through the whole process and get to publication. And I know that one of the things that can really cause us to struggle is that we'll pull a book off the shelf and it's so fully formed and we just have no idea of the work that it's taken and the editing that it's taken to get to that point. So I'd love for you to just, again, you don't have to name any specific examples, or you can if you want, but to give our viewers today some comfort in just really giving them a sense of what's gone behind that finished product of a memoir, and so that they don't feel that that they're expected to produce something like that all on their own, in 3 months or 6 months.
Yeah. It's a lot of doing. It's a lot of drafts. It's often quite a few pairs of eyes on a piece of work. The type of editing, when I'm editing directly on a draft, the type of editing I'm doing, a lot of people assume that it's typos or grammar. I'm actually not great at that stuff. I mean, I think my grammar's pretty all right, but I'm not going through for that. More of what I'm doing in a lot of cases is developmental work. Hey, this character could be stronger. Hey, I'm losing track of this theme. Hey, this whole chapter is put downable, and I need it to be un-put-downable. And that often prompts rewriting entire chapters, sometimes entire sections of the book, certainly shuffling paragraphs around, hitting the delete key so many times. It's a lot of doing, and that's before we even get to the sentence by sentence breakdown, and that's before we even get to things like grammar or typos, you know. So it's a lot of doing. I would say most memoirs I've worked on, most books I've worked on have gone through many drafts.
Yeah. And how often do you get to be there for the whole process, or at what point are you like, I need to bail out now because I've seen so many versions of this. I can't have that distance that's necessary in order to give that feedback.
Every once in a while, I pull on a colleague when I've worked on a particular draft so many times that I couldn't see a developmental issue. Like, is this character working now? Because we've really tweaked it 1,000 times. But more often, this is why I don't end up doing the grammar and the typos, because I mean, my eyes start to skim over the lines. I'm like, I've read this paragraph. We haven't changed this paragraph in the last 2 drafts, you know, and my brain, I guess I read so much that my brain's like, no, no more. It saves its energy. And so that can happen. Yeah. But every once in a while I do pull on a colleague just for something developmental that it's like, I can't see it anymore. I need the fresh eyes to be able to see it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
One thing actually that I found really interesting about the way that you and I worked is that I didn't send you the full manuscript straight away. So I had a draft, but I wanted to do another draft, and I felt that I could see enough of what was lacking to be able to do that on my own. And so I would send you 10,000 words at a time.
Mm-hmm.
But what was really useful is the feedback that you would say, give me for the first 10,000 words, could then start to trickle into the rest of the memoir as I was redrafting it. So I'd love your thoughts, like on someone who's thinking, you know, at what stage should I get an editor? Should I have a draft? Should I be working with them bit by bit? Do you have a sense of what, you know, which way works best for people? Like for me, the 10,000 by 10,000 worked really well for me, but that was because I already had an idea of what I was working on and what I was writing, but it may not be a fit for everybody. So do you have a sense of someone who's like, wait, which service is best for me? What kind of support do I need right now?
I don't do that method very often. The method that you and I used, where you're writing it as you go. And it really served you because it was a later draft, because you'd already drafted it so many times, you gotten distance, you gotten feedback from other people. So I definitely wouldn't recommend something like that right out of the gate. Mostly because someone's just not going to get that much bang for their buck. You know, they're not going to get the value that they want to get out of it. But that method is really useful for experienced writers with later drafts. More often, I have people come to me with a full completed draft of their book or their memoir. And a lot of times, again, when we're looking at, you know, budgets and cost savings and things like that, I'll even have them break down each chapter into like a 1-page synopsis, so that they can say what's happening in each chapter before I read the whole thing. And we can decide if entire threads or, you know, entire themes need to be pulled out, subplots, things like that. And this process itself is often really helpful for people to sit down and summarize their chapter into a page.
Yeah.
And then go from chapter to chapter like that. That's even doing that is helpful for people, let alone the feedback I give. So, yeah, that's often a better way to do it.
That sounds like a really exciting way to do it, the break it down into a page, because I have to say, I'm not so easy with my own work, but if someone sends me a synopsis, I can take a look at that synopsis and pretty soon tell if there's an absence of story. But it's amazing how it's so hard to tell that when it's your own work.
I would agree. I mean, I think it would be very difficult to tell in my own work for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So we've looked at structuring, we've looked at divorcing characters, and actually, folks, I know we're gonna send you over to where you might be able to, if you're interested, get a free consultation, and we'll have a quick chat about what that involves. But there's also a free ebook that you can get on Chandika's website, which is like, I've downloaded quite a few freebies in my time. So this ebook is writing a reader-centered memoir. So let's just take a moment to just get really clear about what you mean there. Like, we've kind of touched on the difference between thinking about yourself as you're working on your book versus thinking about your reader. But I'd love for you to just share a little bit more, like, what exactly do you mean by writing a reader-centered memoir, and like, why is that so important?
Well, because your reader's the one who's reading it. I mean, the truth is, okay, this is difficult to say, but writing about our own lives, there is a degree of self-centeredness that's happening. You are centering yourself, quite literally. And taking the useful tidbits from that and figuring out what is actually most useful for your reader is often a challenging process, but a really important kind of reframe that needs to happen. And that's what the ebook is about, is like how to make that reframe happen. Because it's challenging. It's not easy, you know. Again,
Yeah.
every single one of us thinks that pretty much everything that ever happened to us is super fascinating. And to us, we're right, but not necessarily to other people.
Yeah, I mean, and folks, those of you watching, there's no shame. There's no shame in you having not thought of your reader, because I was completely in that place when I was doing early drafts of my book. It was all about me, and it was all about, like, this story is about me and it's so hilarious, and surely people will be interested in that. And it's the same story now, but I really do now have a sense of the person who's reading the story and why they might have come to that story, which is different to why I want to tell it.
Yes, exactly. Not what you're giving them, but what they're coming to get and whether they're getting it. And I just want to go ahead and say that your memoir is still really funny and fascinating. It's actually funnier and more fascinating, I think.
And yeah, I mean, and I'm really glad that you shared that. I'm glad that you shared that, because the compliment is beautiful. But yeah, for people who are listening thinking, am I going to sacrifice something? It's like, it's become so much better having become more focused on the reader and what they're going to need, what they're wanting as they come to it.
Yeah, for sure.
So the ebook is there. Now, this consultation, I've certainly, the first few editors I've worked with, I've been terrified. I've been like, oh my God, even though I wanted to work with an editor, suddenly the thought of it, I was just like, this is going to be really embarrassing. Am I going to get yelled at? Like, for me, this is all the stuff that gets triggered for me. Like, my whole fear is that everyone's just going to yell at me. That's been there since my childhood. So for those people who, I mean, obviously they'll have got a sense from you, from our conversation today. They'll see how completely approachable you are, how beautifully grounded you are. But for someone who's like, oh God, what am I going to get from this free consultation? Is this something I should be scared about? I'm not really sure if I can handle this. What would you say to them?
First up, the way to get the free consultation is with a form. And I mean, just a typical, sign up to talk to me form. Don't stress out about that form, because sometimes I have people tell me that they freaked out about it and were really worried that I was going to be like looking for a whom instead of a who or something like that. And I am just not that judgmental. You should see editors' emails to each other. They're like lowercase I for I, meaning me, things like this. We're very lazy. They're full of typos. So be chill. That's not the kind of thing I'm worried about at all. And the next thing is to understand, like, from my perspective, again, out of your perspective into a different perspective. From my perspective, I'm like, wow, this person chose to share this deep thing that came straight out of their heart with me. Like, that's wild. It's a wild honor. Working on your memoir, Gabriella, was just it's an honor. Like, wow, I get to like be and they care about my opinion. I'm still in shock of that. I'm still 150 books later. I'm still like, people want me to complain about books and they want to pay me for it. It's kind of blinking in the light. Is this my real life? So this is my perspective. I consider it an honor. Not even it has nothing to do with your writing skill. It has to do with how sacred and deep that is. And so I hold it with a lot of reverence.
Beautiful. And yeah, that was absolutely the experience I had. And I think with memoir, I mean, I've written novels too, but I think it was so important with memoir to have that safety and to have that sense of like, whatever I was going to say, whatever I was going to try philosophizing on, you were going to treat it with the utmost respect. So yeah, that's totally true. So what we'll do, folks, is we'll put the link to the website, and we'll also put a link that will take you, excuse me, straight to the form, which I think is on your contact page. So we'll put 2 links below so you can grab the ebook. And if you want to grab that free consultation, you can do.
Yes, that would be great. I'd be happy to speak with the folks who watch your channel. That'd be great.
Beautiful. So let's just take a moment to pause. And is there anything I didn't ask you that you're like, I wish she'd asked me that? Or is there anything that you're like, there's one more thing that I feel like I want to share for the person who's watching this video?
I guess I would share that I am holding it in great reverence and with great respect, gingerly like a little bird in my hands. Even when my advice to you is to take that paragraph or that page or that chapter or that character, highlight it, and hit the delete key. It's still important. It's still holy. It's still sacred. It's still your gift for the world, even when it's not exactly where it goes, or it's not exactly the time, or for whatever reason, I'm recommending you cut it out, sculpt it out. So just because I don't want people to hear this and think like, oh, she must be really, really easy, because I'm a little bit tough, but but the toughness is done with great respect, I hope. That's my hope.
Yeah, totally. That was definitely my experience. And to be honest, I appreciated the toughness because it gave me the confidence that through our work, I was really going to create a memoir that had a high chance of really having an impact on the reader, because I'd sculpted the story in a way that was going to make it clear to them, rather than just kind of be a story that the reader walks away from going, I don't know, like, it was kind of okay, but I don't really know what I'm getting from that story. So it was definitely feedback that I appreciated.
Good. Well, I'm so glad. It's been an honor to work with you. And thank you so much for having me here today. I really appreciate it.
Oh, my pleasure. So yeah, I knew that there was going to be some stuff that was going to be super relevant for the people in my audience. And yeah, it's been lovely to have this conversation. Folks, there we go. We've talked about structuring. We've talked about divorcing character. We would love to hear from you. Let us know in the comments below any little ahas, any little breakthrough moments. What have been your takeaways from today's conversation? Share that in the comments. Hit that subscribe button if you haven't already, and check out the free links that will take you over to Chandika's website. So great, Chandika. Really beautiful to connect today. Wishing you peace, love, and joy.
Thanks, Gabriella. Thanks, guys.
Bye.
Appreciate it. Bye.